In this painting, a figure, half priest, half sorcerer, stands in a blood-red cloak on the bank of a river of fire. He lifts his hands, and at that very gesture a city seems to rise on the opposite shore, dark, threatening, the kind of place that makes your skin crawl. You do not need to know this story to understand that this is no paradise. Here is another painting by the same artist. Huge cliffs are collapsing into one another. And if you look closely, it gets even worse. Hundreds of people are sliding over the edge into the void. They are being swept down into the abyss, their arms reaching upward, as though pleading with some higher power, as though crying out to God for mercy. But no mercy comes. The painter almost seems to delight in their despair. Two images like these are enough to make you suspicious of the man who created them. Then you learn a few things about his life. His brother was an arsonist who tried to burn down a church and ended up in the asylum. And one of his nephews later took his own life. Suddenly, the whole story starts to feel tainted. Maybe the painter really did have dealings with dark forces. Maybe his imagination was fed by something other than gentle inspiration. Maybe that is why, not long after he died, his work was almost completely forgotten. If I tell you his name right now, it will probably mean nothing to you. And you might think, good. Maybe some things are better left forgotten. But the truth may be exactly the opposite. A painting in which the devil summons an underground city may not be glorifying evil at all. It may be a warning, do not follow in his footsteps. So that is what we have to figure out. And that is exactly what we are going to do. One warning before we begin. Much of what we are about to see is genuinely disturbing. Horror is its purest, most concentrated form. But if you stay with me until the end, beneath that terrifying surface we will discover something else as well. Inspiration, light, and perhaps even a kind of hope. So our story begins with John Martin, who was born in England in 1789 into a poor family, though his talent revealed itself early. His father apprenticed him to a craftsman who painted coats of arms, heraldic designs for the carriages of the aristocracy. It was a respectable trade, and there was plenty of demand for it. The arrangement did not last, however. Money got in the way and the boy was brought back home, but by then the path had already been chosen. Martin kept moving forward. And like so many artists, his road to recognition was anything but easy. In 1812, the Royal Academy exhibited one of his paintings. Not his first work, but the first he presented to the public with the real hopes attached to it. The beginning of his career was a roller coaster. Disappointment followed by sudden success, obscurity followed by attention. That alone could have thrown anyone off balance. But in that very same year, tragedy struck again and again. His mother died, then his father, then his grandfather, and not long after, his young son as well. Martin sank into depression. It would have been strange if he did not. Eventually, though, he found his way back. He had several brothers, and fate was not especially kind to them either. The eldest, William, was an inventor, reasonably successful, but he relied on John in the way families sometimes do. Martin produced drawings, technical sketches, and renders for inventions that existed only on paper. They worked together, certainly, but it is hard to shake the feeling that if John had been a little freer from his brother's influence, his own artistic career might have had more room to breathe. The story of his younger brother, Jonathan, is darker still. He suffered several nervous breakdowns. During the last of them, something happened in York Minster, that magnificent Gothic cathedral. According to the story, the sound of the great organ somehow lodged itself in his mind and would not let go. That evening he stayed behind, hiding somewhere among the columns. The cathedral is enormous. There are plenty of places to disappear. When the doors were locked and everyone had left, Jonathan climbed onto the wooden scaffoldings that supported the organ and set it on fire. The blaze was put out quickly and the arsonist was caught. Under the law of the time, he should have been hanged. But insanity was already recognized in England as a mitigating circumstance, so instead of the gallows, he was sent to an asylum where he spent the last 9 years of his life. So yes, personal tragedy and even madness within his own family was part of John Martin's world. People often say that an artist had to confront the darker side of life. John Martin certainly did. Against that backdrop, in 1812, Martin exhibited his first major painting, Sadak Seeking the Waters of Oblivion. If that title means nothing to you, that is perfectly normal. The story comes from an English novel by James Ridley, an 18th century writer hardly anyone reads today. It is one of those pseudo-oriental tales inspired by the Thousand and One Nights. There is a cruel sultan, a beautiful captive woman, and her husband, Sadak, who is sent on an impossible quest to find the waters of oblivion, a magical spring whose water can erase memory. Naturally, the sultan wants to use it on the woman so that she will forget her husband. In the end, he fails, receives his punishment, and Sadak himself becomes a sultan. But honestly, the plot is not the important part. The image is. Sadak is almost absurdly small, a tiny, stubborn figure clinging to life, while enormous cliffs tower over him like a death sentence. One glance is enough to understand what Martin is doing here. He is being a romantic. Now, the standard explanation goes something like this. The Enlightenment believed in reason. Reason would explain the world, organize it, make it safer. Humanity would eventually master nature. Romanticism is deeply suspicious of that confidence. The world suddenly feels not just beautiful but mysterious, too vast, too complicated, too indifferent for human beings ever to fully understand. We are not its masters. At best, we are visitors here, travelers passing through a landscape full of riddles. Perhaps the perfect image of that idea is Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. A lone figure with his back turned to us, staring into an endless ocean of mist. Beneath the fog, you can just make out rocks and T-tops, but whatever lies deeper remains hidden forever. The world invites you in, and at the same time it frightens you. Friedrich painted that work in 1818, 6 years after Martin painted his Sadak. In one sense, Friedrich was luckier, his painting became an icon. Martin's, on the other hand, was almost completely ignored. No reviews, no discussions, not even criticism. Crushed by the disappointment, Martin took the painting down and brought it home. And there he found a visiting card left by an unknown admirer. Someone had seen what everyone else had missed and wanted to buy the painting. That was how Martin found his first patron. And with the patron came money, and with the money came independence. And with independence he could finally move forward. And move forward he did. But not in the direction most romantics chose. You see, for the typical romantic hero, standing face to face with the sublime power of nature is terrifying, but it is also uplifting. He climbs impossible cliffs, faces down storms, stands alone before the ocean, almost as though he and the world are equals. By confronting forces greater than himself, he somehow grows to match them. With Martin, the exact opposite happens. The human being does not grow, he shrinks. He becomes almost insignificant, an insect that the universe could crush without even noticing. That vision defines Martin's next great painting, Balthazar's Feast. It was the work that finally brought him fame and something close to triumph. The story comes from the book of Daniel. Belshazzar, the last king of Neo-Babylon, orders the sacred vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought into his banquet hall while the Israelites are still captives in Babylon. Then, at the height of the celebration, something impossible happens. A mysterious hand appears out of thin air and writes blazing words across the wall. Mene mene tekelu parsin. No one can understand them. Daniel is summoned, and he gives the interpretation. The kingdom had been weighted and found wanting. Belshazzar's end is near, and that very night the prophecy comes true. Babylon falls to the armies of Cyrus of Persia, and Belshazzar is killed. Martin was not the first painter to tackle this story. Rembrandt, for example, painted it long before him, and comparing the two tells you a great deal about their different instincts. Rembrandt approaches it as what his own age called history painting, great individuals acting out a great historical drama. The emotional center is psychological. We watch the king's terror, his disbelief, the instant when pride finally gives way to fear. Martin turns the whole event into something much larger. His subject is not one man, but hundreds. The crowd moves almost like a single living creature, swept up by panic. Even the universe itself seems to take part in the judgment. Lightning tears across the sky, and the glowing words on the wall seem to reflect the flashes breaking through the clouds. Martin even plays a little game with the viewer. In the background, you can make out the Tower of Babel, unfinished and already half in ruins, but nevertheless, it reminds us where it is all happening. Nearby stands something that looks like a ziggurat. So, on a whole, it's an imaginary Babylon, assembled from equal parts of archaeology and fantasy. But the really important thing is the feeling that the entire cosmos is taking part in human history. This was not entirely new. You can already sense it, for example, in Albrecht Altdorfer's Battle of Alexander at Issus. The impossible bird's eye view, the countless tiny figures swirling across the landscape, the sky opening above them like some vast storm-driven vortex, as though heaven itself has stepped into the battle. Almost 400 years separate Altdorfer and Martin, and yet the resemblance is striking. By the way, if you enjoy discovering those unexpected connections in the history of art, I would really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. It gives me the motivation to keep making videos like this, and it helps make sure you don't miss the next fascinating discovery. So, back to our topic. Where early painters often made a single individual the center of the story, Martin makes entire crowds, whole cities, entire civilizations into his protagonists. But for all their scale, his paintings are still moral stories. The message of Belshazzar's feast is simple and uncompromising. Pride leads to destruction. Even the mightiest king cannot depend on his own power alone. In his next great work, almost a direct sequel, Martin pushes that same idea even further. The painting is called The Fall of Babylon. Here, the architecture becomes so fantastical that it feels almost Lovecraftian in a way. There is the gigantic ziggurat, the sky twisting into a great spiral of clouds, and the bolt of lightning that looks less like a natural phenomenon than some enormous celestial beam. Below, armies pour toward the city and throw themselves against its walls. And if you look carefully, you can even spot war elephants, which makes little sense historically. You can also see pagan altars decorated with the serpents, details that belong more to symbolism than to archaeology, of course. In the foreground, terror and heroism exist side by side. Some people have already given themselves over to despair, while others have chosen to fight to the very end. And once again, Martin gives us a disaster on an almost unimaginable scale, or at least it feels that way to the people trapped inside it. Their city, their home, their entire world is about to disappear. And once again, the lesson is unmistakable. They are being punished for pride, for the fatal belief that they could never fall. To get that idea across, Martin fills his canvases with the hundreds of tiny human figures. In his world, a person is almost an insect, and for a god who looks down from above and passes judgment, the gap between a man and a bog may not be nearly as great as we like to imagine. In that sense, Martin has an important predecessor, Peter Bruegel. Northern European painting developed something you could call the view from above. Bruegel's Suicide of Saul is a perfect example. Saul falls on his own sword, but he is tucked away in the low left corner of the painting, so small that you have to search for him. He is barely larger than the ordinary soldiers still fighting across the valley. Bruegel's point is both simple and merciless. From God's perspective, the death of a king and the destruction of an entire army belong to the same category of events. Human power counts for very little, even when human beings gather in vast numbers. Martin is speaking exactly the same visual language. And as the years go by, the idea of humanity being punished collectively for its sins seems to take a stronger and stronger hold on him. And if that is your obsession, what subject could be more fitting than the Last Judgment from the book of Revelation? Toward the end of his life, Martin began work on a trilogy of enormous apocalyptic paintings. The first is usually known as the Great Day of His Wrath. It shows nothing less than the collapse of the world itself. Gigantic cliffs are breaking apart and crashing into an immense chasm. And then you notice that those cliffs are not empty. Entire houses, towers, even pieces of cities cling to them as though a whole section of the earth have been ripped loose, turned upside down, and hurled into the abyss. Martin was probably inspired by Revelation 6, with its terrifying vision of the sky vanishing like a scroll being rolled up, mountains being torn from their places, and people of every rank hiding in caves, begging the rocks themselves to fall on them and hide them from divine judgment. The language of the painting matches the language of the text. And suddenly you understand why Martin shows so little pity for the tiny figures sliding down those collapsing slabs of rocks into the darkness below. In his eyes, those are not innocent victims. Their hour of judgment has simply arrived. That severity becomes even more obvious in the second painting of the trilogy, The Last Judgment. Medieval art is full of last judgments, and Martin follows that tradition in many ways. At the top, in the center, sits Christ, surrounded by elders dressed in white. Below, humanity is divided into two great groups: the saved at Christ's right hand, which means the left side of the painting from our point of view, and the damned on the other. The damned are slipping down into a sea of fire. Hovering above them is a dark angel with a face that shows no trace of mercy. His raised hand does not look like a gesture, it looks like a verdict. And if you look carefully, you notice something important. Among the condemned are not just ordinary people. There are kings, wealthy men, even a priest. The logic here is deeply medieval and utterly unforgiving. Status cannot save you. Only the life you have lived can. Now, think back to those strange paintings we started with. The devil standing beside a river of fire, raising an entire city with a single gesture. That city has a name. It's Pandemonium, the city of all demons. Martin did not invent the word. It comes from Milton's Paradise Lost. The poem tells the story of the war in heaven. The rebel angels are defeated, cast into hell, and become devils. Their leader, Satan, is one of the strangest characters in all of literature because Milton makes him disturbingly attractive. He is intelligent, courageous, resourceful, endlessly ambitious, and yet his defining sin is pride. For that pride, he is cast down. It is not difficult to understand why readers have always found him compelling. Martin returned again and again to the second book of Paradise Lost, where Milton describes Satan and his followers building their new capital in the depths of hell. Milton actually gives very few concrete details. He tells us only that the city rises with supernatural speed, built by infernal power. that it is immense, that no work created by human hands could ever compare with it. Martin tries to paint exactly that scale beyond human imagination. He was not only a painter, by the way, but also a master engraver. So, in one image, Satan presides over the council of demons, surrounded by architecture that feels almost impossible for human beings to conceive. His throne seems to be built from gigantic stacked towers, almost like miniature skyscrapers resting on an enormous sphere. The hall itself stretches into the distance, packed with thousands of figures. Huge chandeliers hold hundreds of candles, their flames trembling together as though responding to the slightest movement of Satan's hand. And the second version of the same scene is very Martin-like. There is the dark river of fire. Lightning tears across the sky, and from the depths below, a vast palace appears to be rising at Satan's command. In fact, it almost looks unfinished. The upper colonnades already stand firm, while the arches beneath them still seems to writhe and shift, as though the city itself is in the middle of being born. Some viewers look at that city and admire its sheer weight and solidity, its sense of absolute impregnable power. But if we have been paying attention to Martin's work, we already know what he is doing. He is not glorifying pride, he is warning us against it. And Milton, for all his fascination with Satan's charisma, never lets us forget that pride is the first sin, the one from which all the others grow. I think Martin is trying to remind us of exactly the same thing. It becomes even clearer if you look at the silhouette of the palace itself. A long facade of repeating columns stretches out beside the river that is not really water at all, but fire, something halfway between solid stone and molten lava. And since Martin was English, it is hard not to think of the Palace of Westminster standing on the bank of the Thames. The same long horizontal line, the same rhythm of vertical columns. Westminster had suffered a devastating fire not so many years earlier, and perhaps that memory found its way into the painting. Besides, London itself was hardly a pleasant city in Martin's day. The Thames was filthy. A river that looks half like flame and half like black industrial sludge is not such an impossible nightmare version of the one he knew. But the palace is more than its endless colonnades. In the background rises an enormous dome, half swallowed by darkness, but even its silhouette it feels overwhelming. And here I cannot resist one final association. Martin clearly did not intend it, but that dome reminds me of the gigantic architectural fantasies of the 20th century, the dreams of absolute power embodied in projects like Albrecht Speer, who was the favorite architect of Hitler, just a reminder, his unrealized plans for rebuilding Berlin, a classical city dominated by a dome so vast that it would dwarf everything around it. A monument to ambition, certainly, and the belief in one's own infallibility. Perhaps that connection exists only in my imagination, but somehow it fits Martin's moral universe. Whatever wonders pride manages to build, they will eventually collapse. Even pandemonium will one day become rubble, and the one who built it will be buried beneath the ruins. So I do not think we should rush to accuse Martin of some secret fascination with Satanism. The message of his painting is, in its own stern and uncompromising way, almost deeply religious. You can see that most clearly in the final work of his apocalyptic trilogy. The painting is usually known as the Plains of Heaven. After so much darkness, it is full of peace, light, and blessing. And it was just as Martin was finishing that canvas that he suffered a stroke. Half his body was left paralyzed and he never painted again. It is a sad ending. But there is also something strangely fitting about it, as though fate allowed him to complete the journey he had set out on, to say everything he wanted to say, and only then asked him to lay down his brush. That is why it feels so undeserved that Martin was largely forgotten by the end of the 19th century. Remembering him today would do us no harm. His paintings are extraordinary, simply as works of art, but more importantly, they refuse to let us look at them passively. They demand that we stop, think, and ask ourselves what they are really trying to say. And that is exactly what we try to figure out today. If you enjoyed the journey, please finish it with giving this video a like and subscribing, so that you would not miss the next one. Thank you.